Hey, thank you so much, Brian, and thanks to everyone who's joined us this morning or this afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We face some really unusual challenges today in trying to balance patient safety and the safety of our professional caregivers with person-centered values and principles. And we wanted to take the time today to talk about some of the major challenges that we are facing as we try to maintain our commitment to patient and person-centered care in the face of this unusual outbreak. And so we will go through a number of examples for you and some thoughts for consideration around those challenges and tie them to a couple of fundamentals of person and patient-centered care. The idea that we do things with patients and with families and not to them or for them. The importance of not separating patients and residents from their family members, which is obviously an important social support network, and how we might do that safely and responsibly. And also to talk a little bit about the how, because patient and person-centered care is not just what we do, it's how we do it. So how we language some of this, how we communicate at this time is also very important. And so my colleagues here are going to help me out to address those. We're going to look at some specific examples in acute care. Rhonda is going to talk about communication strategies, and Marita, who has quite a bit of expertise in long-term care settings, will share specific information on long-term care strategies. And then again, we hope to have some time at the end to hear any concerns or questions or suggestions that you may have as well. I want to start by saying that we are not infectious disease experts or experts on pandemics. And so the knowledge that we are presenting is based on the lived experiences of patients and residents and their families and what they've communicated to us. And it's also based on current knowledge. And as we all would confirm, we are in a situation that's very fluid. We're learning more literally every day about this virus and how it works. And so suggestions that we have today may need to be updated tomorrow or the next day. And of course, any recommendations or ideas that we share with you are not meant to override local regulations or mandates that in a care setting you may need to be abiding by. One of the things that we have consistently said to patients, families, provider organizations that we work with is that especially now it's important that we stay focused on organizations that provide credible, factual information. And so it would be remiss of me if I didn't point out the importance of staying current with what the World Health Organization guidelines are. That's certainly what we go to on a regular basis. And also your local trusted sources, whether it's the Centers for Disease Control, which many in the US will focus on, or other regional authorities, and we've listed one in the Netherlands. And I'm sure depending on where you are tuning in from around the world, there are local agencies that are your trusted sources as well. But amongst or amid that important clinical information that helps us to ensure that the care that we delivered is high quality, we also have to remember the foundations of a person-centered healthcare system, which is something we all aspire to. And that is founded on partnership with patients and families. And we have to make sure that we don't lose that at this point in time. It also is care that's delivered with compassion, with kindness, with respect. And those are, again, qualities that we cannot lose. One of the concerns that we've had as an organization in our communications with our affiliates has been some of the unintended consequences of restrictive policies that have been put into place in order to react to the COVID-19 outbreak. And while in some circumstances these may be responsible and they may make sense, I think we also have to acknowledge that there are many negative unintended consequences that are also important for our consideration. So for example, my office is in a local community hospital in Connecticut, in the Northeast part of the US. We're about an hour-and-a-half drive from New York City, which has been really the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak in the United States. And what we've actually seen are very restrictive policies in some of the hospital centers in New York City, and women and their partners choosing to drive while they're in labor hours away to come to a hospital that has not restricted the father's access to be present during childbirth. We've also seen parents who are reluctant to take their children to hospitals or into the emergency departments because they've heard that families are separated from their children. And whether that is correct or not, there is this growing and pervasive fear about that. Again, pointing out the importance of being clear in the way that we communicate some of these new and hopefully temporary restrictions. We're hearing of individuals with cognitive impairments, individuals in behavioral health settings, elders in geropsychiatric settings, becoming very traumatized and exhibiting stress behaviors when they are separated from their customary caregivers. We've heard so many heartbreaking stories of patients in hospitals dying in ICUs with no loved one present to comfort them. And of course, there's the impact on staff, staff who are traumatized, who feel left to care for this incredible burden of the physical, psychological, spiritual, and emotional needs of patients when there is no family support, particularly at the end of life. And so these are important things for us to consider, to make sure we include in our calculations as we're thinking about limitations and restrictions. And so I would ask that providers and organizations and individuals who have some influence on local providers think about what are the evidence-based or the factual foundations for visitation restrictions that are being put into place, and are they necessary? And are we really in a situation where we cannot allow family to be present? And so some of the things that we've seen organizations do in order to balance safety with the importance of family presence has been routine screenings for visitors so that they can still enter, but they can enter safely. So they're screened for temperature, for symptoms. Expectations are clearly set and education is provided around other safety practices such as hand hygiene, cough etiquette, etc. Many organizations now are in situations where they have enough personal protective equipment. In the most cases, we're talking about masks, possibly gloves, to provide those to family caregivers who want and need to be physically present with their loved ones. And so limiting visitation, while it may be indicated in some circumstances, may not be in many others. Particularly if these things are in place, that we have these safety practices in place, and the setting is in an area where there is not widespread active community transmission. Obviously, in those cases, it would be the responsible thing to do to limit visitation to circumstances that are more serious. So, for instance, in the case of a woman in childbirth, or the case of a child coming to an emergency department, or an individual at end of life. So we need to be mindful of the impact of any restrictions that we do put into place, whether it's in the acute care setting or long-term care, and Marita will talk about that a little bit later, but to think about the impact of that isolation, that emotional and psychological trauma, which may continue to impact the individuals involved far beyond the hospitalization. to make sure that we are being flexible in special cases, such as end of life, regardless really of the indicators above. Even in areas where there's active community transmission, that we look for safe ways to allow family presence during circumstances like end of life or childbirth. Also, that we make sure that our communication strategies are very proactive, that we are fully explaining to patients and their families why we are doing these different things, how we are trying to protect their safety, the safety of their loved ones, and the safety of our professional caregivers. And I would say, as an end note here, we don't know everything, right, that we need to know or that we might want to know about this situation. And so this is a time for us to be creative and being and open to different types of approaches and solutions, even though we have to acknowledge they're not going to be perfect. Some of the decisions that organizations have made have not been perfect. We're doing the best that we can with the information that we have at any time. So I wanted to provide an example of language, what I would say is person-centered or caring, compassionate language, even amidst the need to limit visitation. And this is a sample visitation policy. I'll give you the URL that you can connect to it if you'd like to go online and take a look at this. But this is a community hospital in an area where there is contained spread at this point, where there is enough protective equipment to be able to provide a mask to a loved one who wants to visit a patient in the hospital. And there is testing available as well. And so I wanted to point out a couple of important things about the way that we convey the information about visitation and family presence. So at this hospital, they've highlighted that the precautions that are being taken, because there are limitations now on the number of family members who can be present at any one time, that these are temporary and they're there to protect visitors, caregivers, and the community. So they're focusing on that importance of safety. That's why there will be some restrictions. They've been careful about the language not to sound too harsh. So for instance, instead of saying that visitors must enter through only this entrance, they've used softer language. Visitors may enter through our main entrance only. They clearly state what the special circumstances are when limitations on the numbers of visitors will be lifted. And that includes at end of life in the case of a child or during childbirth. They use language such as please remain in your loved one's room. And I've seen policies that said you must remain in your loved one's room. There are different ways of conveying the same message. You can certainly do that in a caring and compassionate manner. They've also provided alternatives if family is not able to be physically present with their loved ones, and given some examples such as Skype, FaceTime, or the telephone. They've clearly stated who may not receive visitors or who may not come and visit based on their own physical condition, so that people won't be surprised if they come and are not able to see their loved one. They've also referenced a local mandate. In this case, it's the governor of Connecticut, so that people realize that we can't do perhaps what we might individually choose to do, that we also must be abiding by local mandates. And this is one of the reasons in this case, in this hospital, even though they've maintained visitation in most parts of the hospital, why they've had to limit it in the inpatient psychiatric unit. And then they end with a reassurance that they'll continuously assess these policies and will update them so that they'll maintain that commitment to person-centeredness as well as flexibility in the way that they promote connection between families and patients. So I think that's a really good example for that area, for that situation and community. We continue to encourage hospitals, acute care settings, to really challenge themselves in their own thinking about what they're basing their restrictions on. And we've seen a lot of language that is restricting the presence of any child or minor, anyone 18 or younger, to visit a loved one in a hospital. I understand early on there was concern because children who were in school settings were in large group settings with a lot of interactions, and that might then increase the risk. Now that many schools haven't been in session for a while and are not going to be going back into session for a while, I think the question comes up, is there a factual evidence base for using age as a restriction to visitation? Or should it be recency of a large group interaction? We've already talked about whether you're in a community where there's active spread versus containment, what the availability of protective equipment is, the availability of testing. And so again, just that request that we base our limitations and restrictions around family presence on the guidance of credible institutions and not on fear. One of those credible institutions, as I mentioned before, of course, is the World Health Organization. And I wanted to share something that you can find on their website, very important to that issue of women who are in labor and active childbirth, that even the WHO has put out a notice that irrespective of whether you are in a community with active transmission or not, all women have the right not only to respect and dignity, but to a companion of their choice. So we need to find ways in cases like this where we can balance safety with person-centered care. I mentioned earlier that I provide some links to family presence and visitation policies. The one that I was referencing at Griffin Hospital for guidance for hospitals in areas with low community transmission can be found at this URL, guidance for hospitals in areas that have very active community transmission, where there are more stringent restrictions in place. I've included URLs for the guidance provided at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, which is still under active community transmission, fairly widespread, and the guidelines of the New York State Health Department. And then last note, of course, we're hearing more and more about the longer-term impact of patients in acute care settings who have spent time in the intensive care environment, and it really does pose some very special risks, I think particularly because of the number of patients who have COVID-19 and do end up in ICUs. And we're seeing something called post-ICU syndrome, or PICS, that it's something that not only are patients at risk for, but family members as well. And in part, this is due to the isolation of family and patient, but also due to the fact that many patients with COVID-19 who are in the ICU, maybe in induced comas, lose time and may go into that state thinking, well, I feel some light symptoms, and then days or weeks later wake up and wonder what has happened to me. And that causes quite a bit of trauma. And so we're looking at more and more approaches to try to help with post-ICU syndrome. One of the validated approaches is keeping a diary of the time spent by the patient in the ICU so that can be shared with them post-discharge. And I've provided a link to a digital diary that's been developed, which may be of interest to people as well. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Rhonda Williams, to talk a little bit about how to make sure that our communications remain patient and person-centered at this time.
Thank you so much, Susan. Good day, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you might be in the world. And as Susan mentioned, no doubt we are in unprecedented times. We are in times of challenge, and we find ourselves interacting with our staff in ways that we would not ordinarily. We find ourselves caring for patients in ways that we would not expect to. And through all of this, how do we ensure that we are still making our caring visible? How do we ensure that the innate caring that we have shows through? One way for us to do that is through the words that we use. We know that words create the construct for our experience, and that the words that we choose come with an emotional tone, and it creates an environment. And then that environment may in turn lead to certain actions or behaviors. For instance, if we're using words such as battle or the front lines, what's the tone that we're creating? What's the emotional impact of these types of words? When we are using labels such as hot one or Chinese virus, again, are we putting ourselves in a position to introduce bias, even in an unintended way? And so the words that we choose are important for setting the tone, for creating the space, and that allows our staff to operate as their best possible selves. Consider these phrases. There are times when, even despite our very, very best intention, we use words or phrases, and they may, in fact, have an impact that we do not intend. I know for myself, when I hear the term hopefully, what do I take away from that? Do I feel exactly hopeful? Do I feel positive that this may in fact happen? Or do I feel like, in effect, who really knows if that's going to happen? If I'm using phrases like the truth is, are you really saying that I probably shouldn't be telling you this? And the idea here is simply to consider the words or the phrases that you are using or that you are hearing in the organization, and then are they creating an impact that you don't intend, or are they in fact positioning you and the team to respond in a way that allows you to serve our patients and families the best? So I'd like you to consider, how do you convey empathy? How do you do this in a very effective way? Well, I'd like to share with you a strategy that includes 3 essential elements. Those 3 elements are to recognize, and to communicate, and then to support. And let's talk about what those means for just a second. To recognize means that you are in a position where you are understanding what you're hearing and seeing and around you. What are you hearing and seeing, not only verbally, but what are you feeling in terms of what's not being said, the verbal reaction that you're receiving? So that's recognition. As you then move into your communication phase, we want to be sure that we are connecting from that human aspect that really shows our caring and allows that to come through. So we want to communicate with empathy, and doing so in a way that we are connecting with those that we serve. And then it goes beyond communication and recognition. We want to be able to support. So what can we do? What's the opportunity to take action, to serve, so that we can provide that partnership, which is what we're here for? Here's a scenario. And in this scenario, we wanted to show you what this looks like in action, what it sounds like. Obviously, we want you to use the words that are comfortable for you, the words that are culturally acceptable in your organization. In this scenario, this is a visitor who is screened positive and has a slight fever upon coming to the hospital. So when we use our RCS framework, initially we want to recognize, what might the visitor be feeling? Mind you, they may have just traveled quite a distance to visit their loved one, maybe not even being aware that they had a temperature. And so they might be a little bit frustrated or angry. And you on the other side of this are being protective and cautious, but also empathetic about the situation that they're facing. So how might you communicate this? You might say something like this. It sounds like you're very frustrated with not being able to see your mom right now. I want to assure you that your loved ones, as well as all other patients, are a top priority as we work with you through this situation. We do have some options that we'd like to share with you, if that's okay. And the idea here is to, again, recognize what they're seeing and what you're feeling. communicate in a way that connects and shows our compassion, and then supporting and providing options. There's a few other considerations. In situations like we are facing, some of our standard practices, we are evaluating everything. Nothing feels normal in this day and time. And so as we think about some standard practices such as team rounding and bedside shift change, and also volunteers that serve our organizations, we might be thinking, how do we best protect the safety of our patients and families and our staff? So the tendency might be to do some blanket suspensions of these types of practices. What we're asking you to consider instead is to be very thorough and thoughtful and use evidence-based approaches to how you do this. Now, you and your teams, I'm sure, have been very creative through these times, and we're asking you to continue to extend that creativity to some of our standard practices so that we can safely provide care while still ensuring partnership of our patients and families. In terms of your patient-family partner council, it's another one of those practices that you might consider. Do we suspend the practices? At this point, we don't see any evidence basis for that type of a decision, but certainly you may want to engage in some different types of practices, such as maybe virtual meetings or settings, and engaging that feedback in a very different way so that we continue to have their voices during this time that is very, very important, but we don't disconnect from the activities and the basis of who we are, which is the partnership of our service to our patients and families.
Thank you, Rhonda. And we're going to move now to Marita, and Marita is going to focus on the long-term care and group care setting.
Yes, thank you, Susan and Rhonda. And nice to meet you all here. I've seen you're from all over the world. And like I was introduced, I will tell a bit about long-term care. And we found this picture, and this was a quote from a broadcast in California, as an example of actions family were taking. And some of the media responded like, this was perfectly appropriate. I think it's worth discussing the pros and cons of this response, since it's something that has been happening in response to the very restricted family access. We had quite similar questions from families in the Netherlands. And in the end, there were barely residents taken out of the nursing homes. And I think the best way was just to have the dialogue with the family members about the impact of the care we have to deliver to those very frail persons. And as Susan already mentioned some of the other unintended consequences of the restrictions, we see that in not only individuals with cognitive impairments becoming traumatized and exhibiting stress behaviors, but we also see it with families of the residents. Because they're not allowed to go into the nursing homes. And as said before, also here we see that traumatized staff left to take care of the physical, psychological, spiritual and emotional needs of the residents in the long-term care facilities. So all things we have to consider. In line with the guidance for the hospitals, there is some guidance of the WHO for long-term care facilities. And the main conclusion is, in areas where the COVID-19 transmission has been documented, access to visitors in long-term care facilities should be restricted. So they're pointing out to the areas where transmission has been documented. But also they give a call. Alternatives to in-person visiting should be explored, including the use of telephones, videos, or other protective materials like plastics or glass between residents and visitors. there are reasons to think about when visitors are really needed. And the main reason are on compassionate grounds. For instance, when residents are gravely ill in end-of-life situations. And I think the guidelines of the WHO is what we see in the Netherlands, that in respite to other countries, but in many countries, we are happy that people don't die alone. I brought you this special document. As many of you will know, that the Netherlands is slowly reverse the lockdown. And as a pilot, which currently started this week, a pilot among 26 nursing homes, that's about 1% of the nursing homes we have in the Netherlands. One of the plaintree members, Riva Zorggroup, a gold certified plaintree member, together with a group of experts, developed a guideline to help the complete nursing home organizations in the Netherlands to open up again. And in addition to safety, human and ethical aspects play an important role in these guidelines. Unfortunately, this document is only available in Dutch, but hopefully if you can download it, you can translate it with Google Translate. What I like about this document is that where possible, it's thought to let residents decide themselves. Of course, when they are no longer able to do this, relatives will play a role in this. The aim is to find good, safe and workable ways for all. And for all is for the residents, for the families and for the caregivers per location. So there are in this document national guidelines, but it's not a detailed protocol for all nursing homes. And that's the thing I like. So each nursing home in partnership in their situation can develop its own protocol. I like to share some of the examples because visitation was restricted very much. Now we have 26 of the nursing homes in a pilot. So 99% of the nursing homes still have restricted visitation policies. And what can we do? So the window visits are currently very popular in the Netherlands, especially now that the weather is getting better. And where the building does not have suitable facilities to facilitate those window visits, we see that even with very simple materials like a party tent, window visiting is made possible. We see also that fans are used for that. So inside the fan is split in two. In the front is the part where the family can enter, and in the back is the part where the residents can enter, and that's a way how they can meet each other. Another example to meet is the use of aerial work platforms. And there are a lot of companies at the moment that offer them to nursing homes and make schedules that relatives can visit the residents of the nursing homes. And this is especially helpful when residents have to stay in bed and cannot move between the different levels of a building. Video calling also was mentioned in the WHO guideline. We see video calling is widely used, but video calling has a lot of challenges, mainly for people with hearing difficulties. And in this group, we see a lot of people. I think we should be aware that there are events that require special attention, such as funerals. And video calling is a way to have people, residents, be a bit part of these special and set events. In any case, the numbers of moments of interactions is limited, which is why I like this example very appealing. In this example, we see how family members were able to assemble a placemat printed by a special company that allows residents to see their relatives at all meals, several moments a day. And I'm quite sure that you all have also the Facebook calls to send cards to residents who are lonely, who don't have families to connect with them. And we see that nursing homes do get a lot of attention, get a lot of response on the calls on Facebook. On the right side, you see a postcard which has been developed by the organization, by the nursing home. They held a photo shoot with their residents, and with Easter, they sent postcards outside the nursing home. So I also liked this example. It's the post coming in, and it's post going out of the nursing home. And it's very important to think about the family members who are forced to stay at home. Sometimes they suffer even more than the people inside the nursing homes. We hear a lot from our caregivers that it's on departments with patients with dementia, with Alzheimer. It's actually really quiet at the moment, because there are not so much people coming in and out the wards, and actually that has a bit of positive side also for these frail people, but that doesn't mean that it's hard for the family at home. On the right, you see phone teams that have been set up in some organizations to call family members just for a talk. How are you today? How do you feel? And just some human interaction for a small period of time. And in the end, we have not to forget our staff. The burden on caregivers is great. All over the world, the heroes in healthcare are honored in different ways. And they deserve it so much. We also see that companies send many products as presents to show them their thanks. We see cakes, flowers, chocolates, beauty products, protection materials, and much more. And this whole turn of things, in this whole turn of things, it might just happen that you as an employer forget to be aware of your own personal notes to your to your caregivers. So be aware, be there for your people. They need you really, really at this moment. But also ask them what they need from you. Also, when we go back to normal, I think that we became in a situation in a very abrupt way, and people will also be afraid to go back to normal. And that's what we see in the Netherlands, where we taking this steps at this moment. And it's not only the employees in the most needed professions at the moment that need our attentions. There are also people who are without work at home in our facilities. And they can feel enormously guilty and lost, and they also need our attention. What can we do? A lot of examples you've seen on the slides. Huddles, pastoral care. I think the first one is very important, the acknowledge of stress and grief. And I think we will need some time for that, even after the first period of this enormous challenging time. I like this example wearing the mask, and there are many false expectations about the protection of masks when we are not using them in a right way. This was a poster developed by our Ministry of Health, and I think it's very helpful to help caregivers, but also families, and to use these materials in the best way. We collected some evidence about taking care of caregivers. You can find the information of these resources with the internet links.
All right, thank you, Marita. Appreciate all of the wonderful examples that you've provided from long-term care environments. I wanted to conclude our remarks by issuing a little bit of a call to action to everyone who is on the call with us today, because I think many of us are thinking, well, what's next? What are the next steps? How do we address these challenges around remaining person-centered and patient-centered at this time, and particularly the impact on families and patients and residents? I would ask that you join ISQA and Plaintree in something that we're calling the Pop-Up Coalition to Preserve Family Presence in Healthcare Settings. That coalition is a very diverse group coming together for a short time to take what we've learned from the COVID-19 situation so far and its impact on family presence, and to develop a set of comprehensive guidelines that balance safety with compassion and partnership, and also that support person-centered care principles. Our hope is that once we have finalized those guidelines, they'll be available through ISQA and its online resources, and we would ask all of you to help us to promote these guidelines throughout all of your network of contacts as well. So with that, I think I will turn things back to Brian so that we can take any questions, any concerns, or if anyone has ideas that you'd like to share in terms of solutions to some of these challenges.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan and Rhonda, Marita, for a fantastic presentation. There's overwhelmingly positive comments throughout. Everyone really enjoyed it. So we're going to transition to our Q&A section now. So while I'll ask people to start thinking about their questions and maybe popping them in the Q&A box, but you can also, if you see questions in there that you would like to see prioritized, you can upvote them as well. So please have a look at the questions there. And just while you're working on your questions, I will just let you know that, if you found today's presentation helpful, then please see our COVID resources page as well. We've collated resources from all around the world related to different backgrounds and contexts, and there's useful resources for everyone there in any sort of background and context, so please feel free to check it out. And also tomorrow we have another live webinar with Sue Hignett and Paul Bowie on human factors in the design and operation of ventilators for COVID-19. That's at midday Dublin or London time tomorrow. And one of the small positives that's come out of this whole situation is the strength of the community, the ISQA community and the Plaintree community, and everyone coming together to continue to support one another and help us through this very difficult time. So if not already, then please consider becoming an ISQA member, maybe just to help us and support us in continuing to do what we do at the moment. So yes, I can see the questions flooding in now. So again, thank you so much, guys. So I'm going to jump straight into it now. Rhonda, this first one is from you, from Peter, who said, Rhonda, this is so powerful. I believe this was relating to the table with the different meanings and context behind words. Do you have a compendium of words that we need to change, and how can we have caregivers understand the power of language and words?
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for this question. In fact, our team had a pretty robust discussion around words and what are some other words that we could use. If you visit planetree.org and visit the COVID resources, there is actually a document there that lists out some of the ideas that we came up with. Now, know that this is just a starting point. We identified some of the common words that we hear very frequently and potentials that you might use instead. I would also encourage you to have fun with this. This is, I think, a real opportunity to engage your team, your leaders, your staff by saying to them, you know, we want to look at words. We know the power of words. What are some words you're hearing that don't make you feel good, that make you feel like, you know, maybe we should be conveying a different message? And I think you'll be surprised at how creative they are and how in tune they are with some of the words. And in fact, they will offer suggestions, and then the team can talk about those and come up with which ones you want to adopt as an organization. So firstly, on the Planetree website, there is a document there that talks about some of the words that we've identified, and you might find that helpful. And then secondly, it's a really great opportunity to engage your team and a full dialogue about the power and the impact of words. I think you'll be surprised and delighted at what you receive from that.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Rhonda.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question is from Anthony Staines in Switzerland. In a time of pandemic crisis, it will be great for a hospital to be able to get advice from patient partners about the needs of patients and the messages to spread, etc. Is this realistic? And if so, what will be the practical steps to take to do so?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a really important one because this is not the time to lose that connection with patients and their families in our community about what is most important to them. And so I think there are a lot of different strategies that can be used. One of those I think Rhonda alluded to, if you have a patient-family partnership council, certainly virtual meetings can still be organized, and you can have that ongoing input from them. We also do a lot of focus group work with family, with discharged patients, community members. We've moved a lot of that focus group work to online virtual focus groups or telephone-based focus groups. So that's another strategy. You could look at patients, for instance, who have been discharged recently, who've been through this experience in your healthcare institution, and to reach out to them and ask them, you know, what would have made their experience a more positive experience? What advice might they have for you? Marita, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, thank you, Susan. I mentioned the phone panel, which just phoned to all the families at home. And that was also a way to receive a lot of information about and ideas from them, what the organization could do. As you mentioned, focus groups, I think is a perfect way. But just call them and ask them what would they think, what would be helpful, and that was what we found in the Netherlands with the nursing homes.
Excellent, thanks to you both. And just in response to that as well, we had Charmaine Jones in Canada say that the Patient Advisory Network would like to be involved and are ready to be helpful as well. So our next question from Laurie. I've heard some clinicians don't like being referred to as heroes. How do you manage that when so much language is focused on the metaphor?
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, and I'll just initially respond, and then maybe others have thoughts about that. You know, I think this goes back to the slide that we had with words that we're beginning to hear that are filtering in as we all live this experience, and that there is a lot of military type references that are being used as we experience the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, front lines, and we're waging a war, and, you know, if you are a part of the provider team, you're a hero. So I do understand why some folks would be uncomfortable with that terminology. And I would encourage all of us as a community of caring to be sensitive to that and to perhaps find some alternatives that are more comfortable for people.
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
I could also imagine that when you are mentioned, when you are called the hero, it might be hard to talk about your own fears, your own worries, your own whatever. So I can imagine that it's not always nice to be a hero. I know the intent of people is to be thankful to them, but it might get confusing.
Absolutely. And I'd just like to add to that, it really goes back to the discussion where we talked about intent versus impact. And so the intention is kind, it's genuine, it's compassionate, but the impact and how it lands on some of our caregivers is often not received that way. So I think returning to your original purpose, what is the purpose of using the term hero? I think it's to convey gratitude and, care for the work that's being done. And there are many, many ways to convey that without adding that label that some might be uncomfortable with.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Our next question from Sarah. How do we maintain the enthusiasm of the medical system after the pandemic has ended?
Wow, I guess we all wish we had the answer to that, Sarah. Again, I think that this is something that we have to be very sensitive to on a day-to-day basis. That we not fall into the trap of being so focused on this intense response, thinking this is going to end at some point, and then we'll take care of our staff, or then we'll reconnect to our values as an organization. I think it's important to be having those conversations now as we're going through this, not to fall into that mindset of we're just going to focus on this one thing. We're going to keep as much control as we can, and then later we'll deal with it. Because that, I believe, will make it more difficult as we move out of the intense phase of this pandemic to be able to reconnect to our purpose and our mission. We've got to find ways to do that now. And I think there were some nice examples that have been provided, but I'll give Marita and Rhonda an opportunity to comment as well.
I think we also learn very much from this episode in our lives, because before the pandemic, we had a lot of working groups, and sometimes we had a lot of very tough ways to get change organized in our organizations. And during this time, we see that a lot of issues have been solved in such a easy and quick way that we also can learn from that, and that will also stimulate enthusiasm in our organizations. It doesn't have to be that difficult as we experienced it before. So let's keep the good things from this period, and keep them safe.
Excellent. Thank you, Marita and Susan. Our next question from Linda. How do we enable our health staff to consider shared decision-making in times of crisis when time is short?
And that I think is such an important issue, and it goes back to my opening statement in which I said the founding principle of a person-centered care system is that we do things with patients and families and not to them or for them. And I think one of our biggest challenges right now has been the erosion of doing things with our patients, asking them for their input, and then aligning the way that we provide care and what care we provide along with their values and their preferences. I think that it's a false economy to think that we can't or we don't have time to engage in shared decision making today. I think there's probably never been a more important time to be actively involved in shared decision making conversations with patients and families. If not now, when? So this is really putting us to the test. And I encourage everyone to recommit to those foundations of person-centered care. We have to find creative solutions. We have to find ways. We have to find the time to have those conversations. Now, I realize if you were in the middle of the epicenter, for instance, if you were an emergency department in New York City a month ago, that may be unrealistic. But most of us are not in that situation. Most of us are in communities, in provider settings where there's not widespread, uncontrolled spread, where we can take the time to have a shared decision-making conversation. I would also say the guidelines that Marita mentioned that are coming from a long-term care group out of the Netherlands really deal with those issues of what are the patient's rights to self-determination. And I would encourage you to access those. It's a wonderful ethical document to read. And we did actually already Google Translate it, and we added it to the pandemic resources on the Plaintree website. So you can go to the website, and on the landing page, the banner that says, pandemic resources, and you can find that paper. And I would really highly recommend that people familiarize themselves with that.
And Susan, I'd like to add to that, because I think this part is really important, that this is an opportunity to bring things down and make it very practical and bring it down to its simplest form. Leverage your internal processes that you already have. It doesn't require a separate meeting to get the staff together and ask them what they think. If you are engaged in leadership rounding or patient rounding, or if you're doing huddles, those are prime opportunities to get input and feedback in some formal and informal ways. You can identify little processes. You can have a notebook that people can jot down their thoughts. You can leave it on a unit so that maybe I might not have time right now, but if I have 5 minutes later, I can visit that and jot it down when it comes to mind. So I think keeping it simple and leveraging your internal structures and processes that you already have is really important right now.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. I'm conscious of the time now. We've just gone past the hour. We do have one question here, which I think is quite important. So I might ask just very quickly, if we could, at the end. John has asked, this virus drives a wedge between patients and providers, stretching compassion and increasing stress. Verbal communication is important in ameliorating this, but do you have any tips for optimizing body language while wearing PPE?
Yeah, that's a good one. We've actually seen some wonderful examples of creativity around that, where people have personalized the face masks that they're wearing. So they maybe have a smile on them. Others have created face masks where there's actually a plastic window so that your facial expressions are visible. And so you can just Google those online and make them yourselves, or find places to purchase those. But I would suggest that, because you're right, so much is lost if you're not able to see someone's expression.
Absolutely. And then there are things like tone and your posture, maintaining an open and welcoming posture and a gentle touch. And there are other things that we can do as well while we're not able to see the full face in many times. But tone goes a long way, and you can often hear your kindness, caring, and compassion. I also want to add a really important aspect of this is active listening. And so conveying that you are paying attention, that you are being present, and that you are mindful in this interaction also is another way to convey your caring.